Welcome to the Pain to Superpower broadcast, where I believe I can help you navigate your pain in life and turn it into your superpower. I will be guiding you from the Word of God in my own personal journey through physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual pains. I know pain is subjective and can swallow you up, putting you into a self-imposed prison, if not handled in a healthy way. Pain is real, yet it can be your greatest teacher. Well, hey, welcome back to Pain to Superpower Podcast. I'm Mike Buchanan, your host, and I'm with a great couple, Tom and Dawn Harkus. Now, Tom and I have talked on the phone, and it's been such an easy guy to talk with. He's been ministering for a number of years. He's adventurous, but when we got on the phone, I expected a 10-minute call, and we added an extra hour on easily just because the joy and the things we enjoy doing in ministry. His wife, Dawn, and I go back to maybe 10, 11 years old. So it's been a long trek there. I was the kid that hid in the back row in youth group, and Dawn was up front with another friend of ours, Karen, singing all the time. And then we have grown in our friendship over the years, more in high school together, and always had a passionate heart for Jesus Christ. And I have always enjoyed that with Dawn. And it was like when we were going to talk, we knew it was going to be about the Lord. And those are good friends to have. So Dawn, Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you, ask you to share your story of pain, and then transition into the things that God has taught you through that.
Very good. Thank you. You want me to start?
Sure.
So I can start. Yeah, for Dawn and I both, God has brought us through a series of different painful experiences, but probably the most pointed one is the loss of our son, Chad. And Chad, we adopted it when he was 5 years old. We had a son. We still have our oldest son, Josh, who's biological. And we had always wanted to have a big family. As it turns out, though, God had only given us one biologically after 3 years of waiting. And so we said, as God is working, he brought a series of events along our way, and it really led us to adopt Chad. And Chad was from a high need classification within social services that our kids that get older, they have unique needs where they tend to be difficult to place in a home. And as we prayed, it became really clear for us in unmistakable ways that God wanted us to adopt Chad. That's like one of those things where you're praying, we're like, do we really understand what this is going to mean for our family as we read these different books that they recommend? And then we look at each other, and then God would show us, something that would say, yes, keep moving down this process to adopt this boy. So we adopted him at 5, and we had Chad for 10 years. And it was a wild ride in a lot of ways. Chad was, I used to call him Chatty Boom Boom, because wherever Chad was, he was boom boom. It was something where he had an inability in many respects, even, and when I say inability, I mean, even from a standpoint of psychologically and medically from people that would tell us that is some things he just can't control. There's things that have been fried in his brain from very early on. We were his 5th living situation. So he had been in group homes and in other homes along the way. I think his parents lost rights to him when he was around 1 years old. Yeah. So along that way, he had experienced a lot of different things, a lot of challenging things, even in the group home where he was abused and things like that. So when we adopted Chad, God was super gracious to meet us, but it was a 24/7 experience. I mean, it was, one of the questions was always, where's Chad? And Chad, brought us a lot of joy as well. But it was something that we definitely felt the weight of that responsibility with Chad. And so I wound up coaching different sports, and including like junior high football, because I knew Chad would probably not be able to be on the team unless I was coaching and could kind of keep track of him. Mm-hmm. So, and along that journey is that God worked in Chad's life, and he was able to develop a lot of self-control and able to read. But that all kind of came to a culmination when we moved to North Carolina to plant a church. And in that planning of a church, if you've ever experienced that, and for those who haven't, it's a little bit all hands on deck. Your whole family's involved in it. And there's a lot going on, and responsibility and that comes with every Sunday and every weekend and every outreach service you might have throughout the week. And as it transpired for us is that we would have people coming from the other churches that we've been involved in a leadership training. We would have 8 to 10 people come stay with us. And that summer, this was the first summer, official summer in Wilmington, or maybe second. We arrived in the summer, so it would have been a year later. So we had our first full summer as a church planter, that we had planted the church there. We had a team of 8 to 10 come and join us, young singles that were from the different Crossway, which was a small network of churches that we were part of starting. And they came and they stayed with us for the summer, and we would have the opportunity to do outreach with them. And then at the end of that time, as they lived with us for those eight weeks or so, we would take them on a vision trip, which would involve us going up the coast. And I'd take them to some of the great East Coast cities that needed churches, included New York City, along the way, eventually Boston. But we were in New York City, and this is how it really comes to a head for us, is that Chad was at home with Dawn, and I was with this team of young adults. Chad at that point was 15 years old. And I was with this group, and I had heard about this church in New York City, and where they have a prayer meeting every week, not every month, but every week, where 3,000 people show up for the prayer meeting. And I'm going to probably mispronounce the author is Cimbala or Cimbala, but is Jim Cimbala, where the church where he planted, and was a teaching pastor. So I brought the team there, and unbeknownst to us, they had just lost that day one of their beloved pastors, not Jim, but one of the other pastors. And so they were grieving. The church was grieving the loss of this pastor. And this other pastor, not Jim, but another pastor, opened up the word from Job chapter 38 through 40, where Job, for the hearers may not be as familiar with Job, is he's a man that suffered quite a bit. He was a man who was a righteous man according to Scripture, and God had blessed his life. God initiates this dialogue with Satan, who has access to the throne room of God, and say, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And Satan basically says, if you didn't bless Job so much, then he would curse you. And that's kind of the summary of it. And God allows these trials to take place, which has 2 or 3 rounds of trials, at least 2, that culminates with him loss of all of his children, the loss of his health, loss of his wealth and blessings. And he's in this interaction with these fellow, I don't know, just friends, I guess you could say, of Job, that interact with him and come around him. And they start to question him about, like, what's wrong with your life? Why did God bring these trials? And it culminates in Job chapter 38 through 40, where he's at a point where he starts to question the goodness of God and the character of God, and God appears to him. So this is what is shared that night at this church where we were the night before Chad died. And it has to do with God appearing to Job. And it says in Job 38, it says, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" And he begins in this interaction, and basically, in summary, he says to Job, where were you when I created everything? And then, Job, you really don't understand what's going on. And the net of it is, trust me, trust God. So I walk out of that prayer meeting that's just been communicated for about 40 minutes on this lesson from Job 38 through 40 with the team of young singles. And I said, I wonder if, I've asked myself the question at the conclusion of the message, if God was to take one of my kids, how would I respond to that? And would I respond as Job did? And I said, I think I would, based on all of the things that God has brought us through. I mean, we've gone through some other significant trials. And I said, based on his faithfulness, his character, I think I could trust him in that. So fast forward the next morning, we're in Central Park. We're all split up around fasting and praying. And I'm meditating on the message from the night before.
Wow.
When I wound up getting the call that Chad is gone, our son Chad, that he had in a kind of a freakish, kind of a choking experiment. This is what the coroner and the police told us, that Chad is gone. And that began this very unique time of horrific time of grieving and loss. And so I caught a flight that afternoon back to North Carolina and met with Dawn. So that was our trial. That was what God brought us through. And I thought maybe I could bounce the ball over to Dawn and from her perspective, if you want to fill in any of that.
Sure. Yes. So as Tom said, he was gone with these students, and I think the day before, Chad was our middle child. We had a son that was just going off to college that fall and freshman year. And then we had a baby. Well, she was 3 at that time. And so that's why I was home and not with the team, because we had the little one too. So the Lord put it on my heart. I'm sure probably my time in the Word that morning that, I just feel like I need to be a little more current with Chad, find out where he is with the Lord. Does he know him? Where is he in his relationship with the Lord? So I said to Tom, how do you feel if I get a sitter for Erica and
we
Josh?
Also just adopted.
Yes, he was
at birth.
Right. And then our older son was working with a neighbor. So I thought, oh, perfect opportunity after football. We can, go do something. So we did. We had this time. And I just even thank the Lord for that I had that time with him to find out, where are you with Jesus? Do you love him? Is your life given over to him? And I'll never forget, which has brought such hope, is that he said, I'm thinking about it. And so after he passed, it was like my thought went to the thief on the cross. You never know in that moment as he's, I don't want to get too graphic with it, but basically he was hanging in my garage. And so the thought of in that last moment, could he have called out to the Lord and said, save me? He could have. So I'm grateful for that. I found him. I had helped a friend with her children in the morning. Chad was supposed to clean the garage. Don't get me wrong. I wasn't a slave driver, but he liked doing things like that. So
he should at 15.
And I even said to him, I said, make sure you go play with Andy and, have some fun too. So I kept calling, no answer. And then when I went home, I found him. Pretty horrific. I had my little one with me. I just cried out to a neighbor and she came over and took Erica. But in that moment, I have to say that the Lord was so gracious, because even in the midst of such grief and just horrific pain, I did feel like the Lord's arms were around me. I could feel his presence in such tangible ways. Like just very few times in my life, I felt his presence. My neighbor came right over, my other neighbor, who was part of our kind of new believers in our church family, and they're cracking jokes and all. That sounds crazy, but it was so good to laugh in the midst of pain. But he was plucking actually gray hairs out of my head. So anyway, just interesting experience, a brother in Christ. And just the myriad of people that blessed us with meals and, what can we do, and not knowing what to say, and yet they were there. And then all these different people came for the memorial service, which we both shared at, where we were able to proclaim the gospel at his memorial because Tom was coaching junior high football. Varsity swimming. I was really networked with a tennis group and a lot of women, and the church had just started. So there were a lot of people there. I think we counted maybe 500 or so.
Including the mayor showed up. Yeah.
Yeah. I played tennis with his wife before he was elected. So that's the story there. But anyway, all to say is God was so gracious to bring all these people and for us to be able to share. But we still don't have a silver lining in this trial, even to this day. Maybe a couple people came to know Jesus, but
we're not. Yeah, and maybe if I could add to that, if I could, honey, is it? Yeah, and I think when we thought through Job 38 through 40, we'd like to say through trials that would certainly make life a little easier if you could see that with clarity of what God had done and how he had used the trial. I think for us that the bigger calling or more strategic, I guess, in our own hearts was to trust God when it doesn't make sense, which is the essence of Job 38 through 40, is that there is no apparent rhyme or reason. He has no preview or purview to what's going on in heaven, this dialogue between God and Satan. And so it boils down to, do you trust God when it makes no sense? And I think that's, we thought about, if we could name a theme for our time here, it would be beyond but able. In other words, that God takes us beyond where we are and our
Yeah.
ability, much like 2 Corinthians 1 talks about Paul being tested excessively beyond what he could endure, but God stood with him. I think that's really the theme, is that beyond where we were, but God is able, he's able to sustain, he's able to bring us through that. And I trust, so for us, the biggest challenge was not so much being able to try to answer the why, because it really doesn't appear real clear in our minds. And we had people that left this brand new church that we had just started because, how can God treat his servant like be kind of statements that would leave the church and never come back. And at the same time, I think it just brings us back to that resolve of where, do we trust God when it makes no sense? Do we trust, is he still good? And the answer is absolutely he is, and can we cling to him in those times when it is cloudy and much like many of us deal with sorrows and trials where there's not a lot of clarity on the why. So that's where the Lord is taking us.
Tom, one of the things I've always say about the why question is that the why question will never be answered. The question we need to seek is what? What are you teaching me through this? How can I trust your story? And if I may comment on two things, Dawn mentioned being thankful and sensing a thankfulness. And that's probably the best advice in counseling, if you can help people see what they can be thankful for. And just ask God to show us what we can be thankful for. That'll illuminate a lot and bring freedom. I had another thought, but it flew by. I love Job 38 through 40. 77 questions are asked that we can't answer. Only God can answer. But very powerful testimony of what God's doing. And yet the pain is so real. And working all that together. Here's my other thought. Dawn mentioned going into the garage and sensing God's spirit. Sometimes those most difficult times in our lives are the most sacred. I remember standing on the top of a building, 5-story tall, and watching my son medevac with my wife in a helicopter after having, I forget what the hormone that is released for a heart attack, but like 6 times the amount that a growing male would have in his system. And so it's just those moments can be really sacred if we choose to allow them to be. And we sense God's presence, and it's just so edifying in those moments to have those. So if you can continue and you've mentioned many already, is like, what are some of the best takeaways from that you can share or you feel like you're learning? And like Don said, there's really no silver lining to these difficulties in life, because we'll never know the end result until we have full knowledge of something, and that'll happen when we're in heaven. But
yeah, I would comment, I think, in a couple of things, or maybe one in particular, was that the next morning. So the first morning that I flew in that night, and I decided to go to the house where our son had passed, and Don was going to spend time with another pastor friend of ours and their family that night with our daughter Erica. And I wanted to go to the house and just to kind of get my head around what had just happened and pray and kind of seek the Lord. And so I wound up, though, calling back because I had heard that where we were the night before, that it'd be 2 nights before, was at that prayer meeting, is they had this 24-hour prayer dial-in, prayer request kind of a thing, prayer team that would take your prayers. And so I called them, and I remember it was such a tangible experience for me. Was I got through to them and I started to try to tell them that I had been there 2 nights earlier at their prayer meeting, and that the next morning I had been notified that my son had passed. And excuse me, one of the things that was so powerful for me is when they started to understand. I still, it's been 18 years. I still get choked up on this part, but one of the things that was so tangible for me is that when this individual realized, who had taken my call, this prayer chain call that they just call in, 24-hour prayers that you can call in on, service at this church is that I could see they were gathering people. She said, "Well, just a minute," and then I could hear them praying over me, and I was on the carpet. I was face down on the carpet, just sobbing. I mean, uncontrollably, and I had it on speakerphone because I could hear them pray. I wanted to hear them pray, and it was as if the Lord kind of reached through the phone line and grabbed my heart that was just breaking in ways that I had never, even the loss of my dad, I had never experienced grief like that, kind of deep grief and losing a child. And it was as if the Lord kind of grabbed my heart and held it, and plugged the leak, as it were, or the crack that was taking place. And I just felt through their prayers just drawn near to the Lord in a very moving, tangible way. And so that being the case, is I think one of the lessons out of that was just the power of prayer and how God meets us through the prayers of his people, and specifically praying with them. Like for me, having them, I should probably go back someday. Now it's been 18 years, but I should go back someday and just thank them personally of how they ministered to me that morning. But it was experientially powerful in my life. I mean, to just tangibly sense the presence of God, that was just so assuring to us that the Lord, even though it makes no sense, I'm here. Trust me, I'm good. I love you. I'm kind. I'm wise. So that was one of the lessons I took away from our time.
That's huge.
One of the lessons for me was to, now this reality of life and death before your eyes. It's, you think that all the mundane things seem so trivial, but I remember going into a doctor's office, and the women at the front, somehow they heard, Wilmington's not a huge town, but it's not small either. And they said,
it's about 100,000.
Yeah, they said the phlebotomist just lost their child. And I didn't know they even knew. So I went right back. We didn't even know each other. I hug her. I hold her. She bawls. We both bawl together. And just that merciful side of, which I don't think that's one of my giftings, is being merciful with others. It's just the compassion for people grew. And to just, like Tom said, whether it's praying with them or understanding a little bit more, okay, you deal with depression. I'm with you here. I'm just sitting right here with you.
That was new for me. I'd never known depression before. Yeah.
And I think that clinging and the closeness, which you already said, Mike, but the tangible presence of the Lord and the need to cling so close, because, I think for a lot of people, they can't get up in the morning after something like this, and that feeling of depression or this cloud over you. I know you mentioned about pulling off the freeway because you felt this overwhelming sense of ugh, so that so many people deal with on a regular basis. But then we can help, help them take thoughts captive. And I remember, just because of the nature of how he died, I really needed to, I'd already been memorizing a lot of scripture, but I got those verse cards out and I was just whipping through, because I knew I needed to. I actually asked people to pray. Could you please pray for me that the last memory of my son is not what I saw, but his life. And so needing to take my thoughts captive and think on what's true and right and lovely. I just was, that was really helpful in just washing my mind. And so what Satan would want to have victory there, I'm like, no, you're not winning here.
Girl, I love your story with the interaction with the phlebotomist, because there's a word in Hebrew, it's silent, Shema or Shiva. And it's just like, when people are in pain, you just go there and be present. You don't need to say anything, and everyone's worried about what to say. And this old Hebrew thing is just basically go and be present and be silent. And I did that with my cousin. Everyone's like, you need to go talk to her, Mike, when she lost her husband, and I was doing her funeral in Mexico not too long ago. And I know exactly what to go say. Just go sit on the beach, put my arm around her, and don't say a word. And I think she thanked me for not talking. And sometimes that's all we have to do. So what a rich example of just being present,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's, I appreciate you sharing that, Mike, too, because as I look back, in the attempts of people to minister to us, I'm sure I've been in this situation as well, P.S., but they would say things that just weren't appropriate, and just it wasn't necessary, but beyond that, it wasn't appropriate in certain settings, and I felt bad for them. So we started to try to ease their pain, and found ourselves ministering to them often. But it was a blessing that people came. And one of the things that was harder to understand over time was that some people, they just felt so bad. They said, like, how do we minister to Tom? He's been in a situation in the past ministering to us. How are we going to do this? And by default, they might not come at all, or not say much, or be tempted to not say much. But I think that the lesson, that one of the things we took away was people came. A lot of people did come, and they were with us, and they shielded us, because the community, we were fortunate enough to be very well integrated, as I mentioned earlier, with the mayor and other people in the community. Well, so we're there a year and a half, and over 500 people show up at Chad's memorial service. So it tells you that we knew a lot of folks, and God had granted us a lot of favor and relationships. But I think to see these people come, and then they shielded us and spoken on our behalf, because there was a huge question mark about these new church planters that had showed up in the community. Then, why did their son die like that? What's going on behind the scenes? All these different things. And they were able to step in, even at the memorial service, and speak on our behalf of, hey, I've known Tom and Dawn for 20 years. These are, I lived with Tom and Dawn. These are people that really spoke and ministered to us in a way that was a blessing, that I didn't know how to forecast that, or even know exactly what we needed then, but they came as they were prompted. And many did just kind of be there, pluck Dawn's gray hair, or just be with Dawn that way. Or for me, just to walk the beach with some guys and not have to say a lot.
Yeah. Well, that's beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing such a deep story and being vulnerable with that this morning. And I just hope the listeners are really encouraged by a lot of the wisdom that was sprinkled throughout this conversation this morning, and that lessons are learned through our most difficult times, and pain can be our greatest teacher at times. And we just all want to experience God's love and know God's love through those difficulties. And that's what we hold fast to. And just continue to endure and keep your eyes on the Lord. And he's going to take us through some difficult things that we never stood at the altar thinking we would need deal with, right? But thank you, Dawn and Tom, for your time this morning. And I know this will reach people in a deep, deep way. And if there's any final thoughts, feel free to shoot that out right now. If not, we'll wrap this up and get it out there to people.
Yeah. I guess my final thought would be, is just beyond but able, that phrase that Don and I were thinking about, like how to encapsulate our journey, as mentioned previously, is that I think that God will often take us beyond, and we're like, how in the world could this happen? Because actually it was number 4 of an intense set of 4 trials that it bat cleanup for us. I mean, it was definitely the worst of the 4, but I had a small real estate business, and through the 2005, the crash of the real estate, we lost any money that we had been able to invest. I diagnosed with heart disease, other things. But in that whole process, I just felt like, Lord, reprieve. It's just so, your hand is so heavily upon us. And yet when my thoughts really went back to is that, yes, he takes us beyond that 2 Corinthians 1 passage, beyond what we can endure, that we would find him able. He's able, he's able to sustain us. And I think that's probably the one thing I would want to leave the listeners with.
Yes.
I love that you brought that up, Tom, because when you first mentioned it, I wrote it down and underlined it and put it in parentheses. I'm like, there's the title of the show right there. Beyond and able. What an encouraging word for us all to hold on to. Yeah. Well, thank you again for being on this morning, and so good to see you guys and via Zoom. but look forward to grabbing dinner with you guys sometime soon.
We look forward
And
to it.
that'd be wonderful. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.
Blessings.